welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to take you through the three main components that you need when you're doing project initiation or program initiation. So this video is for the program manager, is for the project manager, it's also for any of the project members. Hello, and welcome to my channel. This is the channel which I use to help aspiring project managers and practicing project managers to succeed. So in this video, I'm going to take you through three main components that you have to understand when you're initiating a program or a project. So these components are communication. We're also going to look into what is communication, why is it important, when to communicate, who is supposed to communicate, how are we going to communicate. We're also going to look at different methods of communication in a project or program environment. We're also going to look at different strategies for communication. We're also going to look at the stakeholder analysis in communication. We are also going to look at the communication strategy document, all the sections in the communication strategy document. The second part is going to be on risk management. We are going to look at what is risk in a project, why is it important, who is responsible for what risk, what are the different approaches of risks that you should expect, what are the different reactions or responses that you should react to in the different responses that you should make in a project environment. We are also going to look at the risk register. We are also going to look at a risk strategy document, a risk checklist. Then the third part that we are going to look at is quality management. You have heard people talking about triple constraints, but you have never heard anyone talking about quality. People are always referring to cost, scope, and also time. But quality is very important in a project or program environment. So this is the last section we're also going to look at in this video. I would advise you to watch the video up to the end, because at the end of this video, you are going to understand the blueprint that you must use when you're initiating a project. So let's get started. Have you ever asked yourself, either as an aspiring project manager or practicing project manager, how information flows into the project, outside the project, and also within the project? Don't worry, in this video, I'm going to take you through one of the very important components or tool in a project management setup or program management setup. It's called, you need to appreciate and understand what is communication in a project setup or in a program setup. So, we are now going to go through the communication process in a program or project. Let us understand. Communication in a project, it's not all about sharing information. It goes beyond that. There are so many benefits of doing communication in a project. One of them including team collaboration, also clarity. So we are now in also achievement of project timelines. So what is this communication? Communication covers a broader spectrum in terms of project management. You need to understand 6 basic concepts of communication or 6 basic components of communication. So the first one is what to communicate. If you're a project manager, which is you should be able to understand from a bigger picture what needs to be communicated. We are going to go through these components for you to appreciate how you formulate the communication strategy document. So after understanding what needs to be communicated, for example, you might want to communicate end of stage or end of phase. For example, you might want to communicate if there's an exception. You might want to communicate, say for example, you have missed a deadline, or maybe you have lost your biggest customer or your biggest supplier, or there is a major catastrophe in the project. You might want to communicate. So that is very important. It is very important for you to understand, if you're a project manager, what exactly are you supposed to communicate? Communication, remember I said it before, communication can be outside the project, or it can be into the project, or even within the project. But what exactly do you need to communicate? That has to be very clear if you're a project manager. From my experience, that is one of the first things I always make sure that I document what needs to be communicated. I hope you have enjoyed the video so far. If you are new to the channel, don't forget to click the like button, the subscribe button, and the notification button so that you are the first person to be notified each time a new video is uploaded on this channel. It will also help the channel to grow. It can also help the channel to produce more videos. Then, the second component is, why do you have to communicate? That is very, very important. You cannot just communicate to anyone for whatever reasons. There must be a specific reason here. Then the third component of it is when. So when are you supposed to communicate? In other words, we are talking of the frequency here. At what frequency are you supposed to make the communication? For example, if you are communicating with project board members, most of them, they don't want to be involved into the day-to-day running of the project. So therefore, they might end up suggesting that let's have it maybe after a month, maybe during the start of the project, which can be changed towards the end of the project. So they might suggest that we want the communication or progress in the project after a month. So you'll find that after a month, you have to prepare the required documents, the required reports, and then you communicate with the project board. So when to communicate is very important. For example, if you have got your team members, there's something that you know is a bit complex, you find that regular or daily communications are very important than weekly or monthly communication. So when to communicate is very important, and you must consider that as a project manager so that you don't miss any type of communication that might be required at any given point of the project. What I normally do myself is to make sure that I create the stakeholder analysis properly, and then make sure that each and every stakeholder you identify the communication. I'm going to cover that in a few seconds to come. So after understanding when to communicate, you also need to appreciate where to communicate. You don't just communicate. There are some cases where you need to understand exactly how are you supposed to do the communication. Is it going to be done in a face-to-face? Are you going to do it in the project office? Are you going to do it in head office? If it's you have so many geographical locations, that is very, very important. You need to know where are you going to do the communication as a project manager. Then, after understanding where you're supposed to do the communication, you also need to appreciate how are you going to do the communication. Sometimes, from what I've seen with my experience in other projects, when it comes to how are you going to communicate, there are some cases where probably just a report is enough. So how are you going to communicate? You communicate through a report. That becomes very, very simple. And then, after understanding how you are going to do the communication, one also important point is who is actually going to do the communication. That is very, very important. You don't want communication to be done by anyone, especially if you're working on a very sensitive projects. You don't want everyone to just be communicating. You do not want everyone to just be communicating to everyone at any given moment. It must be controlled. So who is going to communicate is a very, very critical question you should answer during the startup phase of the project. For example, you might say, when it comes to communication to the board, then it means the project manager is going to do that. When it comes to communication to the, say, technical committee, of course, as a project manager, you might be available, but your lead technical person should be the one to communicate to the technical body or to the technical committee, just to make sure that in terms of the domain language, they are using the right domain language. So that is very, very important. Who is going to communicate? It must be very clear in terms of roles and responsibility. One of the most important activity to be done by a project manager or project team member when you're formulating the communication strategy is to start with what is called a stakeholder analysis. So what is a stakeholder? A stakeholder is anybody, any individual, any company, any entity, any regulatory authority that has got interest in the project. So let me say it again. What is a stakeholder in a project? A stakeholder in a project is any individual or business, organization, or any entity that has got interest in the project. So why are we understanding and reflecting on this definition of stakeholder? Stakeholder analysis is the first stage that starts when you want to formulate any communication strategy in a project program. So what is stakeholder analysis? Stakeholder analysis is after identifying all the stakeholders, anyone who has got interest, anyone who has got interest, anyone who has got an influence into the project. We all consider those ones as stakeholders. So you want to communicate with these stakeholders. How do you start? Where do you start from? You start by creating what is called a stakeholder analysis matrix. I'm going to show you this as we go. So what does this matrix contain? It's going to contain what information are you supposed to communicate with whichever stakeholder you have in the project. You also want to establish why do you have to communicate that information with that specific stakeholder. It is very important. You want to make sure you understand why a specific stakeholder they require that information. For example, in my experience, I've seen that if you're running a project, say for example, it's a construction project, you normally have some agencies or inspectors who wants to inspect the building, for example. They want to understand, is it being done according to best practice in terms of safety of the public, for example? Is it being done according to those laws and local regulations? So the why part of a stakeholder is very important. You need to answer the question why that stakeholder must be communicated to in the project or throughout the project. Then when you're doing stakeholder analysis also, you need to establish when are you supposed to communicate with the stakeholders. That is very, very important. You need to understand why I should be communicating and when I should be communicating with the stakeholders. There are certain stakeholders who might want some communication, say after a certain milestone, okay? There are others who might want it on a certain frequency of saying every month, every year, depending on the type of the project, depending on the size and how long you're going to be implementing or running that project. So the when part, which is the frequency, is very important when you're doing stakeholder analysis. So on your stakeholder matrix, you must answer the question, when are we supposed to communicate with this identified stakeholder? That line must be very clear. You specify at what frequency are you supposed to communicate so that people, they get information in a timely manner. You do not want some information to reach others when you're almost through with the project and they are communicating information from the beginning of the project. That will not make sense. Then also, as part of your matrix, in your stakeholder analysis, you also need to understand where are you going to communicate this information. Is it something that you have to go to your head office to communicate? Is it something that you have to do virtually to communicate? Or is it something that you think it can be done maybe through a phone call? So it's very important to understand. Then the next part of it in your stakeholder matrix creation is who is going to be responsible for that communication? Who is going to be responsible for that communication? Is it the project director? Is it the sponsor? Is it the project manager? Is it the team lead? Or is just a team member? Or even quality assurance team, or audit team, compliance team? That is very, very important. You must be very clear in terms of who is supposed to do the communication and when are they supposed to do the communication? Why are they doing the communication? And who is going to benefit from that communication? Then the last part of it on the matrix is to identify how are you going to communicate. To be honest with you, from what I've seen in my projects before, different stakeholders, they have different requirements. They have different preference in terms of how the communication should be done. Some might say an email is enough. So how are you going to communicate with them? You communicate through an email. That is accepted in some environments. Then you find some environments they want face-to-face. How do you communicate? They'll tell you, if we are going to have any project board meeting or steering committee meeting, it has to be face-to-face. So it means you have to travel from wherever you are, you have to travel to have a face-to-face meeting at project board level. I've also seen some cases where others would say an email is enough, or even a phone call is enough. Some they even say a voice note is enough in terms of how you should be communicating with those specific stakeholders. So the how part of it is very important. You need to understand. It's very important that you understand how are you going to communicate with any of the identified stakeholders in a project. If you have understood what are the channels that can be used in terms of communication in a project or in a program environment, don't worry, I'm going to take you through all the channels that you need to use in terms of communication in a project setup. So let's dive in. So the first item we are going to look into in terms of communication channels in a project or program setup environment is meetings. I don't think there's anyone who has never attended any meeting in any corporate environment. Meetings these days, they can be done in two parts. It could be virtual, which means you can do it online using tools like Zoom or even Teams. So that is the first part of it. Second part of it, it can be done physically, which means you have to travel or you have to move from one office to the other for you to have a meeting. But in all cases, a meeting is very important for communication, it's very important for collaboration, it's also very important for stakeholder alignment. So during the meeting, one of the very important points you have to consider when you're running the meeting is to make sure that everything is quite documented, everything is also summarized, everyone is very clear on the agenda of the meeting, what has been discussed, everyone is very clear in terms of action items from the meeting. If you want to understand or you want to learn more about how to run effective meeting, I've done a video on how to run effective meeting. You can also check it on my channel to appreciate how to run effective meeting and therefore allow your project to be very successful. So the second channel that you can use in a project or program setup is emails and memos. So these days, emails, I have to be honest with you, I've tried using emails in my project. They're a bit slow in terms of communication. Can you imagine you can send someone an email around 8 in the morning and then you find that person responding to you around 6 in the evening. So as much as emails, they are very good, especially when it comes to record keeping, I find them very slow these days. If you try to use other platforms, like for example, you try to use the WhatsApp or even Skype, you find some of them, they're a bit faster as compared to emails. However, that does not stop you from using emails as a communication channel in a project setup or project environment. You can also use memos just to send to members or any stakeholders to appreciate what is happening in the project. So it is one of the channels that you can use for communication in a project setup, emails and also memos. But just make sure that in terms of your emails or memos that you are sending, there's no ambiguity. Everything should be very clear in those communication channels, email and memo. And also make sure everyone has got access either to the memo or to the email. You must be very sure in terms of the distribution list, who are the recipients of that email, so that you don't send email to the wrong people. You end up confusing everyone, because the information that goes there through that email, maybe that group of people, that individual was not expecting that to come to them, so it will cause confusion. That is very, very important. The third channel that is very common in a project communication setup is to use project management tools. You have heard about Asana for project management. You have also heard about Trello for project management, even Microsoft Project for project management. So these tools are also very important when it comes to communication. Say, for example, you have a specific task to be completed by any of the project members. Using either a task manager or you're using even a project plan, you can communicate with the team to say, this specific task was supposed to be completed on this day and is due either in 2 days or it's already overdue. You need to work on it. So that is very, very important. You should learn to use tools in a project setup. These days, it's very easy to use some of these tools, and they make the communication a bit faster. So project management tools are also another way or a channel or channels in a project which you can use for communication, and you should make use of them. That's what I normally do in my project. I always make sure that I use tools. They help to automate some of these things, like reminders. They also help to automate some of these things like report extraction and also progress updates and so on and so forth. So I would advise you from my experience that you should always be using project management tools in terms of communication channels. Now, the fourth channel that you can use for communication is the reports. You can also use reports as part of your communication. Say, for example, you were running a certain phase of the project or a certain stage of the project, and it's almost completed. You want to communicate, for example, lessons learned from that phase, or you want to communicate follow-up actions from that phase. So you can put it as a report, and then you can share it with the specific stakeholders so that they can understand in terms of that phase, what was done right, what was done wrong, and how do you consolidate the gains from that specific phase. That is very important. You can also use the reports. For example, if it was an exception report, which means you have gone past a specific deadline, you want to ask for additional budgets, for example, additional funding, then you can produce a report that can clarify what actually transpired, which led to the current situation where you might need additional budgets. So a report is also very, very important. The other item I've seen as a communication channel in a project used by others is surveys. I've used surveys once in one of my projects where you want to get as much information as possible from project members, or you want to appreciate where the specific approach is working. Say, for example, you're using agile approach or waterfall, even hybrid. You want to appreciate if that is working or it should be changed. You can throw out a survey to your project members, you get feedback. So that kind of feedback you're getting is also part of communication. Someone is telling you what is working well and what is not working in a project. That is very, very important to consider as a project manager. So as a project member or project manager, you might be asking yourself, or you might be wondering, what is the impact of effective project communication in a project environment or in a program environment? Don't worry, in this video, I'm going to cover the 4 most important impacts that you can see or you can have in a project communication through the project communication process. So let's get started. So the first impact of effective project communication is alignment of stakeholders. If your communication is very clear and concise, avoiding any ambiguity and confusion, and if your communication also is very timely, which means you're communicating it the right time when it's required. It does not make sense. Say, for example, you're already closing the project, then you're communicating about project kickoff. It does not make sense. So your communication must be timely. Okay? So as long as your communication is timely and also is very clear what you want to communicate, it's going to remove a lot of confusion. And it's going to make sure that all the stakeholders involved in that program or project, they're aligned on exactly what are the objectives of the project, what is the scope of the project, what are the major milestones of the project. That is very, very important to consider if you're a project manager. I've used it in my project, you should be able to use it in a project. The second impact of effective communication in a project setup or project environment is to make sure that you are also increasing collaboration amongst your team members. Collaboration is very important. Teamwork is very important in every project setup. So how do you make that teamwork very effective? How do you make that teamwork very collaborative? You have to make sure that you are doing the communication right. So if you are doing your communication right, you'll find that team collaboration naturally becomes very easy. But if your communication is causing confusion or anxiety in the project team, you would find that there's no collaboration. People are not very clear on exactly what they're supposed to do, or whether they're going to use some inputs from another team, or they're going to use some outputs from another team for them to achieve project tasks, or for them to complete end project deliverables. So if you want the team collaboration to be very high, just make sure that your communication is very effective in a project setup. That is very, very impactful in a project setup. So the third impact that you normally get when your communication is very effective in a project setup is mitigation of risks. Remember, communication is not one way. It's communication outside the project, communication into the project, and also communication within the project. And it's normally a two-way communication. It's not always from project leadership all the way down to the team members. Communication also can even come from the bottom up or top bottom, like that. So how does it impact the effectiveness in a project? It's good for risk mitigation. There are some project members who are very good at picking some risks, which you, as a project manager, you might fail to pick them early. So if your communication is very effective and open, these members can even approach you as a project manager to say, as much as you're putting effort towards achieving this particular deliverable, are you aware that a specific customer is going under? And this specific customer is the one who is going to be the beneficiary of that specific product that you want to create in that project. Just an example. So you, as a project manager, you note that as a risk, that you're working on a project to produce a specific product, and the targeted customer is actually going under in terms of business operations. So who is going to use your product? Then you start managing risk from there. For example, instead of focusing on that only customer, you might try to widen in terms of the use of a product by other customers. Already, you're mitigating the risk against that. So also, if your communication is very clear, I've been in a project where one of our very key member resigned. And it was key, I'm telling you. But I was lucky because I normally set up a very open communication system in my projects. One of the members had to pass that information to me and said, this specific member, I'm just going to call them X, is about to leave the project and the organization. And there's no one else who knows what he's doing. So I had to take that as a high risk. I started looking around for replacement. Fortunately, I was lucky to get one from outside with almost the same skills to replace that individual. But imagine if my communication was not very effective, or maybe it's blocked, it's only top to bottom. I was never going to get that information, and I was not going to be able to mitigate against that risk. So communication, effective communication in a project is very, very important when it comes to mitigating against risks, because you get information as early as possible from any stakeholders of the project. That is very important for you to consider as a project manager. What impact of effective communication in a project environment is to increase the outcome or the likelihood of the outcome of the project to be very good. I'll give you an example. You want your project to be delivered within the specific timelines, but your people, they're not aware. They don't know when are we supposed to finish a specific task, which deliverable or product is supposed to be done earlier than the other one. But if your communication is very effective, you've actually managed to identify the products or deliverables in a project, or even tasks or actions in a project. You've also prioritized them in terms of which one is supposed to go first, and then the next one. You then communicate that with your project team. Your project team is going to take it as theirs. They're going to own it, because they're going to be very clear on what exactly they're supposed to produce and by what time are they supposed to produce. So if your communication is very clear, you are increasing the likelihood of the project to be successful, for the project to achieve its objectives, for the project to complete its scope. So as a project manager, you must be very, very careful. You must make sure that your communication is effective if you want your project to be very successful. That is very critical. That is very important. You should take note of that. I've applied it in my project. You should be able to apply it in your project. So the first element in an effective communication setup environment is clarity and precision. So if you want your communication to be very effective in a project setup, make sure it's very clear, very precise and concise. What do we mean by this? I've seen some case studies on projects where there's no clarity. There's a lot of gibberish in some communication. There's too much information in the project, and you find there's too much even documentation in the project. So if you try to appreciate and understand what exactly was this communication, it will take you time to appreciate. But what I've done in my projects is to make sure, say for example, I'm sending an email, where it's very necessary to put it in bullet form, I do that, and I would advise you to do that. If it's not necessary to put it in bullet form, but make sure your English is very clear. I was involved in so many projects with different nationals. I think one of them, the highest I had, was about 11 nationals. And the language of the project was English, of course. You would find in such a setup, it was very difficult for me if I was going to use any jargon, which is not familiar with anyone. If I was going to use any big words, English big words, no one was going to understand my communication. So having a challenge of a multinational setup environment or project, the best that I did to achieve to complete that project was to make sure that my communication is very clear and it's to the point. If ever there's a need to separate the communication, I'll do that. It's better for me to send 2, 4, 5 communications, but with very basic, precise, and concise information or message. That was very, very helpful because it was not confusing anyone. I've seen some other project members writing a very long email in terms of communication. So when you try to go through that long email, by the time you go to the end of the email, you might have forgotten everything that you have picked earlier. That kind of communication is not required in a project. It must be very clear and precise. The second element is timeliness. You want to make sure your communication is communicated or is passed, your message is passed at the right time. Say for example, you have segmented your project into 4 milestones. I don't think it would make sense for you to start making communication about the first milestone when you are already doing the 3rd milestone. It does not make sense. Assuming it's a software development project, which I was also involved, you have gone past the analysis stage and also the build stage. You're already testing the solution. Then you start communicating about kickoff or you start communicating about analysis. That does not make sense. So timeliness of communication is very important. Say for example, you want to communicate about end of a phase or end of a stage. It is better you do it exactly after end of that stage. You don't need to wait for another stage to start and then you start communicating. Maybe there are specific lessons you wanted to pick from that particular stage. How are you going to apply it when you are already past that particular phase? So it is very, very important for you as a project manager to make sure that one of the elements of your communication to make it effective is timeliness. Always communicate whatever needs to be communicated in a project in a timely manner. That is very important. The third element of effective communication in a project environment is relevance. I have to repeat this. Relevance of communication is very important. I've seen some other project managers making mistakes where they start communicating some information way past that milestone. Doesn't make sense. It must be relevant. It must be relevant within the project. It must be relevant outside the project. It also must be relevant to all the stakeholders that we have identified in a project. Remember, we've spoken about stakeholders before. So each and every stakeholder that you've identified, you need to also pick the relevant information they need and the timing of the information they need. That is very important and it's going to make your project very successful. I've done it before, I expect you to do the same. And you'll be successful, I was successful before. Then, the next element that we're going to look into this video, or we're going to discuss, is feedback. If you want to be successful in a project, just have an open mind to accept feedback from any of the stakeholders. It could be board members, it could be regulatory, it could be an agents, it could be your own team members, it could be the legal team, it could be any other projects. For example, you might run a project that is going to provide input to the other projects in a program environment. So you need to also be getting feedback. Say for example, after a certain meeting, you might also request feedback from the team in terms of the agenda of the meeting, in terms of what was discussed, in terms of what were the action items, the general feedback from the team members. Most of them, they give you raw feedback, which is very important for you as a project manager. Some can even come and say, I've seen it in my project. One of my members came and said, Oscar, this thing you're trying to do here is going to fail. I said, okay, fine. How is it going to fail? And why do you think it's going to fail? I can tell you I was surprised. This guy had done his research and he knew the direction we were taking, it was not going to be successful. So we had to mitigate against a number of risks that this guy was also pointing to me. So getting feedback from any project stakeholder is very important in a project. It makes your project very successful. Hear it from me. I've done it before. It works very well. You must have a feedback mechanism or feedback group mechanism within your project. That is very crucial, and that is going to make your project successful. So the next element of effective communication in a project is what is called active listening. If you're a project leader, project member, project manager, you must learn to have active listening skills. This is very important because you want engagement. You also want the retention of project members in any discussion, in any communication. So if you're not able to listen to them, you'll find in most cases they'll keep quiet. They won't contribute. So you should be able to listen to whatever is coming from any project member, any project stakeholder. Where it's necessary, like what I normally do, I also summarize the discussion points. Just to make sure that whoever was giving you information, we are communicating that I had time to listen to you, which is a very important point. And this is what I got from our communication. This is what I understood from our communication. So normally myself, I summarize the information, I send back to whoever brought it to me, so that it becomes very, very important. Active listening as a project manager or project leader is very important in a project environment. It's going to take you very far. It's going to enable the project to deliver objectives. It's going to make the project very successful. So you need to take note of that. Practice, it's a skill. Even me, I'm still perfecting it. It's a skill. Active listening, it's a skill. Because when you're talking to someone, there are people they have different ways of expressing themselves. Some of them might even touch on your nerves emotionally. So you need to let it go, understand, get the point, and then move on. That is very important. The next element of effective communication in a project setup is empathy. You should be able to put yourself in someone's shoes just to be able to understand or to feel how they're feeling. That will also help you to manage their emotions, and it will also help to build a relationship with any project stakeholder. You should be able to address people's concerns. How do you address that? If you don't understand, you don't feel like them, then it's very difficult for you to address it. Empathy helps you to build a trust among your project members. If you don't have any empathy in terms of your skills, then it will be very difficult to address some of these things. It will be very difficult to get some of the tasks completed, and it might also be very difficult to meet any specific deadlines. That is very important. So always have some empathy as a project member or project leader. That is very, very important. It's going to help the project. It's also going to help you to have a very successful project. So the last element for effective communication that we are going to go through in this video is consistency. I've seen so many project managers making that mistake. Their message is not consistent. Today they say something else about the same subject. Tomorrow they say something else about the same subject. Today it's very simplified. Tomorrow it's a very complicated message. The third day is one of the longest messages being shared. So in terms of effective communication, be very specific and be consistent. Always send the same message to the same stakeholders, to the right people. Don't send a message which is not consistent in any way to the project members. You are going to cause a lot of confusion. You can even reduce the momentum of the project because your communication is not consistent. Say, for example, I've seen another communication from one of the project managers. They were saying, the other day they were saying, we are supposed to work 3 hours over weekends. Then after a week or two, you see another communication which says, weekends are a working day. So you find members are asking themselves, if it's a working day, is it going to remain 3 hours? Or is it going to be a normal working day with 8 hours? Or even beyond 8 hours? Are we going to start at 8, 9, 7, or 10? Are we going to finish at 6? So consistency in communication in a project environment is very important. You should build that skill as a project manager or project leader or project member. It is very critical and very important that each and every time you make any communication is very consistent. That is very, very critical. The first communication which is done in most environments is verbal. So verbal communication can come in terms of face-to-face discussions. It's also verbal. Or it could be a phone call discussion. It's also a verbal. So verbal communication, in most cases, it has got a direct interaction with any of the stakeholders in a project. It could be from you as a project manager to a project team member, or from you as a project manager to a project board member, or you as a project manager to any regulatory authority. So verbal communication is one of the most common, according to my own view, communication in a project environment. You find most of the meetings, they are verbal. whether it's virtual or it's physical, but in most cases you'll find most of these meetings, they are virtual. The second type of communication is non-verbal. In this category, we are looking at, for example, emails. It's non-verbal, but it's also communication. You are sending email for someone to execute a specific task. It could be even a memo. It's also non-verbal, which you can send. Or these days, we have so many platforms. For example, it could be WhatsApp, which is very common. You can send it. That could be Skype, which is also very common. So this type of communication does not allow, or does not require that you should have a face-to-face, for example, or interactive. It's something you send, you wait, and then you get a response later. But it's also very important in a project environment. It could be a report, like I explained earlier. A report is also very, very important as a communication item, but it's also non-verbal. So when it comes to non-verbal communication, it could be body language, maybe in a meeting, or facial expressions in a meeting, or maybe it could be written communication. So written, we're talking of emails, we're talking of texts, in other communication, SMS that you can use in a project. That is very, very important. The other type of communication is also whether it's internal communication, okay? So for internal communication, when we say internal, we are saying internal to the project. So each project has got its own boundaries. So when we say internal, it's within the boundaries of the project. In most cases, you'll find it starts from the project manager, you have your team leaders or team managers, and also you have your team members. So that is within the project setup. So when you're communicating within the project setup, you also have different ways of communicating to make things very clear. Assuming it's a technical project, obviously, you use what is called domain-specific language, which means you use the technical jargon so that everyone can understand. But you'll find that it will be difficult to communicate if you try to use the same jargon outside the project, especially to the project board members. You don't need to go as deep in terms of technical jargon as much, because these are outside members of the project. They just oversee the project, but they don't really get into the details of the project. So you have to water down your technical jargon as you move from one place to the other, or from one stakeholder to the other. So the next type of communication could be external. You want to communicate with the external world from a project. Remember, I said project has got boundaries. So anything that is coming outside of those boundaries is external communication. There may be reasons why you have to have this external communication. One of them is assuming your project is within a program, which means there are so many projects running, and you, as a project manager, you are running one of the projects. And that project is going to produce a product or a deliverable that is going to be used by other projects within the program. So that kind of communication is very important, especially in terms of progress. Because if you slow it down, if it's an input to another project, it's also going to slow down or to affect the timelines of the other project. So that is the kind of communication that we're talking about. It's external to a project. It could also be, say, for example, I've run some projects where the regulatory authority was also involved. So I had to be communicating with these regulatory people on I think it was 2 weeks basis, or fortnightly. There was a report I was producing, so that at least they can get it. So that was external communication. So in a project setup, outside the boundaries, you're doing external communication. You might also be producing a certain product, which is going to be used by a customer. The customer is outside the organization. So as the customer is expecting that product to be given to them, say for example, it's a part, machinery part, or even car part, a car part, or even machinery part, which is going to be consumed by another customer. So you might need to be communicating with the external customers, depending on the frequency that you have agreed, but they are also interested in knowing how are you progressing with the project so that they can align with whatever internal, whether it's marketing they want to use, or maybe they also want to use it to mount additional machines in their organization. So that is also very important. That is also a scenario of external communication that you should expect in a project environment. So the next type of communication that you can have in a project environment is visual. To be honest with you, this is one of my best communication type that I use in my projects. Visual is very important. You want to be able to show progress of the project, especially when you are showing it to the project board. They are not very much interested in the details. They want to understand, you started on this particular day. How did you progress in terms of your project activities? For example, you might do it as a chart. Even a pie chart is okay. Even you can use it as a graphical chart, it's also okay, or timeline chart, it's also okay. I normally use those ones because when someone is seeing a visual representation of an update, they are normally quick to understand the clear picture of the progress than someone who is reading through some text. So I would advise you, where it's applicable, don't just jump into using a visual communication where it's not necessary. But I would advise, if you've got an option to use text and visual, you rather go for visual than text. So the other type of communication is also informal. There are so many ways I've gathered information myself. I've gathered information about some risks in a project, some information in a project, some delays in a project because of this informal communication. What do we mean by informal communication? You can even have a discussion with someone over lunch, dinner, or even coffee, tea, whatever you want to take. Then, to be honest with you, from my experience, the gold mine of information are the project team members. They give you raw information, very raw. They'll tell you exactly what is working, what is not working. They give you feedback right away. So if you want to have very effective communication in a project setup, make sure that you don't make everything very formal. You can even make it very informal. Even inside chats with someone else on any communication platform, you might end up getting more information. There are some people, when they are gathered in a meeting, for example, or in a room, they find it very difficult for them to say something or to open up in terms of what they are seeing. It's not good for the project. But if you take them aside, engage them, talk to them informally, you get more information which you can use for the success of the project, which you can use to achieve the objectives of the project. So informal communication, always consider it in your project. Don't block it and say everything must be formal. Write me an email, call me, write me a report. There's some information which comes informally, but very important for the project. So you need to consider that if you're a project member, project leader, or even a project manager. Very, very important. The other type of communication is the formal one. I think most of the people, they're used to the formal communication. What do we mean by formal? These are like agreed formats. For example, you want to communicate on a report. You come up with a format for a report. Everyone, when they want to update you on any progress, they complete the report. We normally call them templates. They go through a certain template, filling in all the information, and then submit to you. Or else, they might even send you an email. I've seen some project managers requesting to receive emails every Friday about what someone has done over the week. Although, it might not be necessary, but there are certain projects, you have to do that. You need formal communication. If it's going to be audited, or it's likely that most people are going to dispute whatever you're saying, then you might need to communicate formally. That is very important. Once you start communicating formally, it means there is a recording of what has to be done. That is very, very important. The first challenge that you face when it comes to communication in a project environment is miscommunication. So what do we mean by that? Like I said earlier, in some situations, if your message is not very clear, it will be very, very difficult for anyone to execute any of the communication or any of the expected results from your message. So your message must be very clear and concise so that there's no any ambiguity. There is nothing that is going to confuse people. If you do any of the miscommunication in a project, you are likely going to get wrong results. You are likely going to have missed deadlines. Or you're going to have nothing being done at all in a project. And I don't think, as a project manager, that is what you expect. So always make sure that you reduce any miscommunication in a project setup. If whatever language you're using as a communication tool is not well understood by everyone, try to encourage some translation to their specific language so that at least if you are working in a multinational environment, like what I normally do, at least your communication is very clear to everyone. You cannot be using English in a project where English is not the first language. Or you may not be using another language in a situation where not so many people, they understand that language. It will cause a lot of miscommunication. So always make sure that there's always enough communication, there's always precise communication, your message is very short and it's very clear. That is very important in a project environment. One of the challenges you face in a project environment is the language barrier. I was involved in a project where I had about 9 nationals, and English was not actually one of the preferred languages for some of the nationals. They could understand, but they would take time. So I could see that there was language barrier in a meeting. So what I used to do was to make sure that I simplify my communication as much as possible. Even if I've got very specific language domain or project management domain statements, I was not able to use some of them because I knew the moment I start switching to that language, so many people are not going to understand my communication. So language barrier is one of the challenges you'll face in a project. These days, most projects are not done in one place. They have what is called different geographical locations. So when it comes to language, you need to be very, very careful. Even if it means you have to have someone who's going to translate, say from English to French, French to English, English to French, like that. The third challenge you will face when it comes to communication in a project setup is information overload. This day and age, you are likely going to have information overload because you have so many platforms that you can use for communication. For example, you can even have reports. I've seen others creating even some digital products like ebooks just for communication. I've seen others writing very long emails with so many attachments. So information overload in a project setup is one of the challenges you face when it comes to communication. You overload people with a lot of information. Most likely they are going to misunderstand your message, and most likely they are going to fail to achieve their objectives. They are going to fail to achieve or to deliver their products or deliverables or to complete their task. So it is very, very important for you to consider not overloading anyone with any information in a project environment. Always make sure that you provide the required information at the right time to the right people, not just to include everyone or every participant or recipient in any email where they are not supposed to be getting that. It will cause confusion. Always make sure you target your message, you target your audience, you target your stakeholders. That is very, very important when it comes to communication in a cooperative environment. That is also very important when you want to limit the information overload in a project environment. The next challenge is inconsistency in terms of communication in a project environment. I've seen some project managers who are not very consistent in terms of their communication. Say, for example, you have agreed with the project team members that you are going to, on a weekly basis, you're going to give them updates, progress updates on what they've achieved, what they're yet to achieve, what are the milestones, close milestones, imminent milestones, and so on and so forth. Then you're going for 3 weeks without making that communication. Then maybe the following weeks you do it every week, you stop again, you do it monthly. So consistency is one of the challenges you're going to face in terms of communication, not just from the project manager to the project team members. Also, it could be from project team members to the project managers, into the project and also outside the project. So there must be a lot of consistency when it comes to communication within a project. But that is one of the challenges you're going to face. Take it from me, I've seen it before. If your communication is not consistent, you are likely going to achieve your objectives. You are likely going to complete tasks within the deadlines. You are likely going to have budget overruns. So always make sure that as a project leader or project manager, you have some form of consistency in terms of your communication in a project. That is very, very, very important. Also, one of the challenges you're going to face when it comes to communication in a project environment is technological. What do we mean by that? This day and age, most people are having virtual projects. People are running projects virtually. That's what I mean. You don't need to be in one place. But you find that in some places, technology like internet is very slow or it's always disconnecting. And they might disconnect when you're actually discussing very, very important tasks or activities in a project. So you're likely going to face that technological issue when it comes to communication. There are also some countries where specific platforms, they're not allowed. For example, there are some countries where you cannot call someone on Skype, you cannot call someone on WhatsApp. So for you to be writing emails, which you know they are very slow in terms of getting feedback, you won't be able to be using those platforms going forward. That becomes one of the biggest challenges that you're going to face. So technology, you must choose the right technology from the beginning before you start a project, because that is very important. Which technology are you going to use? Which platforms are you going to be using for communication? Are they allowed in all the countries being represented by your project team members? Are they allowed by all the stakeholder countries or communication protocols which you are going to be engaging in the project? That is very important. One of the challenges you're going to face is lack of feedback. Feedback in a project is very important. You want to know what is working well, what is not working well. You want to record lessons learned from the project. You want to pick and also document any risks identified in a project. So if you're not having a proper feedback loop, or you're not getting enough feedback from the team, as a project manager, you cannot know everything. There are also cases you need other people to help you to either identify some risks, to help you also to mitigate some risks, to help you also to improve some either meetings or the way things are being done. It could be even quality. You want people to help you to improve on quality. You want feedback, either internal or external, to your customer, contractors, regulatory agents, and so on and so forth. So as a project manager, I would advise from my experience, you should always have a way to get feedback. It's going to be a challenge, but you should always have a way to get feedback. In some cases, you won't get any response. That is fair and fine. In some cases, you get. But the best is at least to try to have some feedback, and then you're able to move forward to make your project successful. One of the challenges you're also going to face is geographical location. What do we mean by that? Most projects are now being delivered remotely. But there are certain places where, for example, one of the projects I was involved, we had members who were 8 hours behind the project location. So which means when it's night in that area, it's day. We are waking. But when we are sleeping, the guys are up. So it was a big challenge, honestly. I've gone through that. It was a big challenge because sometimes you want to have some meetings, some calls during the old hours in the other area. And also the members from that area, they also want to have some clarifications, and you guys, you're no longer in office. So you're most likely going to face a challenge when it comes to geographical location in a project scenario, especially if your members are dotted around the world. That is going to be a very big challenge in terms of time zone, especially time zone. Time zone is going to affect everything. So you need to come up with an approach which is very simplified. For example, I had to agree, that example I was giving earlier, I had to agree with the project member to make sure that they switch their time. We had no option because the client was 8 hours behind them. So we had no option. So we managed to negotiate that they sleep during the day in their time zone and they work during the night, so that we're able to synchronize our communication in the project. Those who are on site and those who are off site. It's something that I've used. It might not work in a scenario, but it's better to try to make sure that these time zone issues due to geographical differences, they are also mitigated, they're also resolved or even managed throughout the project. That is very, very important. So the next challenge is cultural differences. It will be very unusual or rare for you to run a project these days with people from the same culture. It's normally a multicultural environment. So when it comes to culture, especially when it comes to communication, the communication styles are different. And something that we might consider lightweight in terms of communication, it might invoke some emotions from another culture. So this is one of the challenges you're going to face. I also had the same challenge where, for example, starting of coming to office or starting time in office, we had agreed it's 8 a.m. But for some cultures, you'll find people start at 10, some even 9, 9:30, 8:30. So that was not allowing me to synchronize some of these activities because some people, they come at 8, some they come at 9. So cultural difference is something that you have to manage. You will never avoid it as long as you're in a multicultural environment. You cannot avoid it, but you can manage, you can find a way to coexist with these differences. So that is very important to consider. And it's going to be one of the challenges you're going to face. Whether you're running a small project or you're running a big project or medium project, cultural differences, you have to manage them throughout the project. The next challenge you're going to face is unclear roles and responsibilities. You should always make sure that you have clarified, you have defined the roles and responsibility of each and every stakeholder in the project. It could be a team member, it could be a board member, it could be a contractor, it could be a vendor, it could be an agent, or even regulator. There must be some clear roles and responsibilities. This is one of the challenges you're going to face because the moment you're trying to assign a specific role or responsibility, I've seen it, people will resist. They don't see it as their responsibility to do that. They want to push it to another team and so on and so forth. So from the beginning of the project, especially in the project startup stage or initiation stage, make sure that you have very clear roles and responsibility. Once you have roles and responsibility, it becomes very easy for you to specify the communication channels. Who is supposed to communicate what? Say, for example, you have an administrator. You don't expect your administrator to be communicating with your project board. You as the project manager are the one who is supposed to communicate with the project board. But the administrator is supposed to communicate with you as a project manager. So the roles and responsibilities must be very clear. In terms of communication, who is supposed to create what communication? It must be defined. This has to be done even during the stakeholder analysis matrix, where you're defining what information, who is supposed to receive what, when, and how. You also need to define the roles. That is the who part of it. Who is supposed to do what communication in a project. That is very critical. The last item, but not least, or the last challenge that you're going to face when it comes to effective communication in project environments is the resistance to change. So most of the projects, they have certain objectives or intentions. You might end up with a result, or you might even end up with a product, or maybe you might end up with a service. But as you create this product, service, and result, what I've seen in one of my projects, I've done a project in one of the banks, and they were using a certain old system which we were supposed to interface, and there was no need to have any members who were taking information from the old system and then typing it into the new system. So that whole department had to be reassigned to other activities within the organization. So when we're trying to communicate to them, to try to get more requirements, to try to understand what exactly do they do so that we can automate that process, there was a lot of resistance. So communication, or trying to get any communication through members in a project, you're going to face it. Some will resist, because some, they're in the project not because by design, but their department heads, they just requested them to go into the project. So their mindset is not actually about the project. So you find them, they'll be resisting so many things. So your communication should also be clear, so that you try to mitigate against this risk of resistance. If your information is not clear, you find a lot of resistance, because people, they don't understand what you're trying to communicate. People, they don't appreciate what you're trying to communicate. So that is also very, very important as a project manager. Have you ever imagined, as a project team or even as a project manager, how are you going to manage the uncertainty in the project? What is called risk management. Don't look elsewhere. In this video, I'm going to take you through all that you need to manage uncertainty in a project. That is risk management. So let's get started. So let's start with the definition of risk in a project. There are a number of definitions for risk. However, what I'm going to share with you is the definition which I think is very much oriented towards project management. So what is a risk in a project? A risk in a project is a future event or a group or a set of events. If they occur, they are going to affect the achievement of the project objectives. So let me say it again. A risk in a project is a future event or a set of events. If they occur, they are going to affect the project objectives. So depending on where you're coming from, or depending on the organization, some organizations or even some sections of the industry, they are still classifying a risk as either a positive risk or a negative risk. So you might be wondering in terms of what is a positive risk and what is a negative risk. So a negative risk is something that is going to affect the project, which means what can go wrong. So that is the negative risk. There are also cases where you have a positive risk and you might want to capitalize on it. For example, a certain event in the future, from the definition that I've earlier articulated, a certain event in the future might also provide an opportunity, either for a new project, for new business, or even to accelerate the current project. So you should be able to distinguish the two. Although in most cases, risk is normally looked at as a negative impact to the project. So we are going to discuss more details as we go through the video. We are going to dive more into this positive, which we call opportunities, and also the negative part of the risks, which we call the threats. So let's move on. Now, after understanding what is a risk in a project, we also need to appreciate how does it impact the project? Why is it necessary for someone to know or to understand risk management or management of uncertainty? So every project is exposed to so many challenges. Some of them are known as you start the project. Some of them you get to know them as you move from one stage to the other, or from one phase to the other. From my experience, most of these risks, they are not very easy to identify, but in some cases, they are very easy to identify. But however, what I normally do when I'm starting a project is to make sure that I have a risk workshop. So you might be asking, what is this risk workshop that I'm talking about or that I'm referring to? So a risk workshop, the way I normally conduct it, I pick the key project members or team leaders who are going to contribute much into the project per each and every area, which I normally call a work stream. A work stream is just a specialized or a divided or categorized area which is expected to be producing certain deliverables in a project. So I identify work stream leads and also key project members, like for example, the ones from ICT, from finance, from quality assurance, from audit, from compliance, and so on and so forth. So once I have these teams in place, we go into a workshop. The purpose of the workshop is to take through the team the risk cycle in a project. We are going to discuss more about the risk cycle in the next sections of the video. So during the risk workshop, the process is to identify the risk and also to assess the impact. Since most of these participants in this workshop, they are more on the technical side of knowing the impact and also the probability of the risk to occur, it is very important that you take note and you listen to them as a project manager. The information they give you at that point might be based on a experience, it could be based on some studies, and so on and so forth. So you need to listen to them if you're a project manager. You pick the risks, you identify them, you categorize them, you also identify how are you going to respond to each and every risk. We are going to go deeper into the categories and also the risk responses that you can also provide in the risk management process. So one of the advantages of having this risk workshop during the start of the initiation stage of the project is it also serves two purposes. The first purpose is you are going to be able to identify and also prepare most of these risks for the future of the project. Then the second part of it is also going to work as a learning process for the participants. They are going to appreciate what is going to be the risks in the project, and also instead of just relying on the risk register, which we're going to discuss more again, they are also going to take it from day one, what they have to do, what they have to manage manage any future unexpected events from happening. That is very, very important. And as a project manager, you're expected to do that. Always do a risk workshop, which you are going to take through the team, the whole process of risk cycle, which we are going to discuss in the next section. So, there are a number of tools or documents that you should make sure you are recording in the risk management process in a project. The first one is the risk checklist. I've also added a link on the description below in case you want to download a risk checklist. You can also download. It's a free download. The second part is what is called a risk register. We are going to go through the risk register in the next section so that you can understand each and every column, each and every information that you have to record in that register. Then the third one is the risk management strategy document. This is a very, very important document which you have to create during the project initiation stage. So we are going to dive in again into these individual tools one by one so that at least you can appreciate them. But before we do that, we need to go through the activities that you have to do earlier before you create a register or even before you create a risk management strategy document. So let's move on to the next section. So in this section, we are going to look at the risk categories. So there are quite a number of risk categories that you can consider in any project, depending also on the industry, depending also on the sector, and also on the type of the project. So we are going to look into a number of them in this section. In this section, I'm not going to go through all the categories that you need in a project because they depend on project to project. They also differ from industry to industry, even from country to country. So I'm just going to look at an example or examples of these categories that you need to consider, but they are very, very important for your project. The first one is environmental. There could be some environmental issues that you have to consider. So therefore, if there's any anticipated risk from the environment section or environment category, therefore, you should be having a category in your risk categories called environmental category. The purpose of this environmental category, I can give you an example. Say, for example, your project might be affected by weather. For example, construction projects can be affected by weather. So if, say, there's going to be some landslides or there's going to be some floods, definitely your project is going to be affected. So you need to consider that as a risk. Say, for example, the risk of having floods is most likely going to affect either the project timelines or even some of the already delivered deliverables. So this is an example of an environmental related category. The second category is going to be on the economic category. For example, you might have a project you are working on. Say, for example, it's building a new product which you want to launch into the market. And due to the market changes or the economic environment changes, maybe there's too much inflation, as an example, prices are going up at a very high rate, or even there's downsizing in terms of production. So definitely that is going to affect your project. You want to launch a new product and the economic environment has changed. So you might be forced to either downscale the project in terms of what you want to produce, in terms of the product, or you might be forced either to change the scope or to reduce the scope of what you're supposed to deliver. So this is how normally the economic environment is going to affect your project. So you should have a category called economic category. Another example of this category is the legal or regulatory environment. So you find that you might be working on a certain project, and on this project, probably you want to come up with a certain process or way of doing things, or you want to produce a new product to enhance or to expand your business. And then there could be a regulatory change. Another certain product will no longer be used in a specific environment, and therefore it won't make any sense for you, either as a project team member or a project manager, to continue with that project. So you'll be forced to stop the project and then consider other options. So that is very important. Another example of a risk category is technological. There are certain projects which are viable because they are based on a specific technology, but as soon as that technology is removed either from the market or it becomes obsolete, it won't be viable for you to continue working on that project. So there's a risk that the technology that you are using is most likely going to change, and if it changes, you also need to assess the impact, and you also need to know the probability of that change to happen. So you must have a category under your risks which is specific to technology. That is very, very important for you as a project manager. So, like I said earlier, a risk can come as an opportunity or positive side, or a risk can come as a threat, which is the negative side. So there are certain specific responses that is expected from either you as a project manager or as a project team member on how you're supposed to respond in case the risk materializes, which means instead of being a risk, it becomes an issue, which means that future event, it has occurred. So how do you react to that? So in this section, I'm going to take you through the two sides of it, the upside and the downside on how to react to a risk once it has happened. So let's move on. There are basically 6 responses that you can apply to any threats or to any negative side of a risk. From my experience, I normally summarize them as RAFT. So you might be wondering, what does it stand for? So A, it stands for avoid. There are certain cases where it becomes very easy for you, either as a project member or project manager, to avoid a specific project totally. For example, if you know that there's a certain technology which is no longer going to be supported in the next 5 or 10 years, it's better you avoid using that technology. You go for something that you know you're going to use for a long time. Another example is, say for example, you're running a project where you're using a machine that is using, for example, a plastic part. In order to avoid either overheating or melting or machine breakdown in future, you might try to avoid that risk by going for something like steel or metallic part to replace the plastic one. So that's how you can avoid a risk in a project. It's very, very important. That's what I normally do in my projects. I always try to make sure that where it's possible, sometimes it's not possible, where it's possible to avoid the risk, avoid it, than to try to manage it in future. You need to take note of that as a project manager. So now we look at the S part of it. S part of it on the threats or the negative part of risk is sharing. I normally see it in the investment scenarios. Say, for example, a specific bank, they want to lend money either to a specific multinational company, a big one, or even to a government, a big one. They normally go through what is called syndicated lending. So what does it mean? The exposure of one entity is too much. It might even bring down the entity. Say, for example, the exposure is about $4 billion US. So most of the companies would go down if they go for that deal, and then there's some issues in terms of repayment or in terms of the investment materializing. So in that case, you'll find that such kind of risks, they require sharing. So if you're running a project that has got a very high risk, to such an extent that it might even sink your organization or your business entity, it's better to share in case it happens. For example, I've also seen it in some entities, they go for insurance. If you know there's going to be a very serious financial impact, you can also take insurance against it. In case it happens, at least you can recover from the insurance. So these are some of the things where, these are some of the scenarios where you need to share the risk or the impact of the risk. Normally, on the financial side is the easiest way to share the impact. In other cases, you might also want to share the impact by subcontracting. I've seen in some of my projects that I've done, the business or the organization decided to subcontract so that they have a fixed amount they're going to pay. They don't need to pay extra in case there's some unforeseen event that might occur during the process of running the project. So subcontracting is also another option which you can go for in order to share the risk if you're a business entity, especially for high-risk projects that you might want to run as a project manager. So the R for as raft, it stands for reduce. So as a project manager, there are cases where you need to reduce the risk in a project. I am going to give you a very simple hypothetical scenario, life scenario. If you know that there's going to be a delay in using the road way of getting from one point to the other, you might want to reduce the risk by going through a train or maybe by flying to that place. So you have not avoided the risk, but at least you have reduced it, because you know flying, it might be delayed, but not as much as road traffic. A train might be delayed, but not as high as the road traffic. So that is how you can also reduce risk. There are certain cases where you are not able to reduce the risk. So this is one of the items we're going to discuss as we move on to how do you respond to some of these risks. So reducing a risk also in a project is very important. Like I said earlier, in your workshop, these are some of the questions you should be posing to the participants. How do you reduce some of these risks? How do you share some of these risks? How can you avoid some of these risks? That is very, very important if you can do that. So the next part of it, which is the A for accept. There are certain cases, even in my experience, there are certain cases as a project manager, I had to accept whatever has happened in the project as a risk, because there isn't much that you can do. For example, you might have a high staff turnover in a project, or even death of your key members in a project. There's nothing that you can do. You need to accept it, and then you need to move forward by planning or introducing more people so that you move on with the project. There are certain cases where you cannot control anything. We have seen it with COVID environment. During COVID, no one had planned for a closure of 6 or 5 months or 3 months at all. Everyone was planning to thinking that everything was going to work well. But when COVID hits us, we had no option. We had to accept that we have to stop projects. We had to accept that we have to protect the lives of the project members. So there are so many cases where you have to accept reality. You have to accept that it has happened. There isn't much that you can do, but to move on and make sure you deliver the objectives of the project. So it is one of the responses that you also need to consider, especially when there are threats or there are negative impacts of those events. So the other response that you can do to any threats or negative impact of a risk is a fallback. So what do you mean by fallback? This means you are going to allow the risk to happen if you cannot control that, and then once it has happened, you fall back on your plan B or plan C action. For example, you might incorporate additional time in your planning. In case there's a delay or there's a risk of a certain contractor to delay some of the things that you want to use in your project, you can also allow that additional time to cover up for that. The other fallback could be additional budgets. You might also want to have additional budget specifically for risk coverage. In case there is something that is going to happen in future that is going to affect the current budget, then definitely that budget is going to save you as plan B. Or even you have alternative activities that you need to take. In case this supplier fails to provide a specific product which is very cheap, you might have additional budget to go and buy from the very expensive supplier, but you know that at least within some hours, some days, some weeks, or some months, you're going to get your product. So that is also another form of fallback that you need to consider, especially when you're faced with a risk or a threat which you have no control, but you have to let it happen and then you react from there. In some cases, it's also worthwhile to transfer the risk to other parties. For example, I think I've said earlier, you might want to transfer the risk of overrunning your budget in a project by subcontracting to either vendors or even to other contractors. So it's also a very normal way to respond to any threats. You have gone through your risk workshop. You have identified that there are certain uncertain activities which you are not able to manage. For example, budget. You're expecting that or anticipating that there could be additional money required to do some activities, and you are running on a very strict budget, low budget, and therefore the only way you can do that is to subcontract the effort. In case it's delayed, in case that risk materializes, the subcontractor is the one who is going to bear. Okay? The subcontractor is the one who is going to bear or is going to take care of the additional costs. So you have transferred the risk. There are also some cases, for example, insurance. You know that this is not going to happen very well. If it's going to happen, it's going to sink the organization. So you also transfer that risk. For example, safe unrest. In most cases, safe unrest, they are very costly. So through insurance, you can even transfer that risk when you're running the project. Now, let's move on to the positive side of a risk. Remember our definition of a risk. It's any future event that can occur and affect the project objectives. One of them is sharing. Okay? In case there is some opportunity or there is some positive event, then you can even share with others. You can even share with others within the project. You can share with others outside the project. You can even share with others within the organization or outside the organization. So there could be an opportunity. Maybe you were about to create a certain product. Then there's some technological advancement which brought up some other technology which can provide you or which can enable you to produce better or even more of those products. So you also take advantage of that. Then the next part of it is enhancing. So what do we mean by enhancing? Enhancing is how can you make it better if it happens? Like the earlier example I've given you. You were working on a certain technology which was only going to allow you to produce 2 products at any given time period, say for example 2 months or 3 months. Now there's going to be a change of technology which is going to allow you to produce at least hundreds of those projects or deliverables. So definitely you want to make sure that you enhance, you increase the chances of that happening. Then this third part of how you respond to the positive or the opportunities from a risk is what is called exploit, which means you are going to increase the probability of that happening so that in case it happens, you can make use of it, you can take advantage of it in order to increase the chances of your project. This normally happens especially when you are creating a new product as compared to a construction project or even a software development project or even an event management process, which is also normally run as a project. So you need to exploit what has been coming out of the project. You need to exploit what has been coming out outside the project, and so on and so forth. Then the last part of the upside of a risk happening is also to reject. You also have an opportunity as a project manager when you're running a project to reject a specific risk. It might come as very attractive, but you might have realized that it's only a short-term item, and therefore you reserve your rights to reject the outcome of that in terms of upside. That means you are also in control on whether you should capitalize, you should exploit, you should share, or you should enhance the positive side that is coming out of the project. So that is very, very important to consider as a project manager. So if the risk is going to occur, which areas is it going to affect? Or if it's a set of risks, which areas are going to be affected because of that risk? So that is what we're going to go through this section of the video. So the first part is timeline. As a project manager, you should be able to assess the impact of the risk on the timeline. There are certain risks, if they occur, you might be forced either to stop the project altogether, or you might be forced to scale down in terms of your scope. So that assessment is very, very important. If you are still to deliver the project within the same timeline, and a very major risk has occurred, which becomes an issue, you might be forced to change the scope in order to stay within the timelines. The other section is the costs. You should be able to assess the impact of the risk on the cost. In some cases, some of these risks, if they happen to be on the negative side, they are going to affect the cost. You are going to end up with a project that is going to have a project overrun or budget overrun in a project. So you also need to assess the impact. Like I said earlier, during the workshops, you should be able to assess the impact of each and every risk especially on the time and also on the cost. That is very, very important for a project manager to consider, especially during the initiation stage of the project, where you are going to be identifying most of these risks, you are going to assess most of these risks. You should consider to assess the impact of each and every risk. Also, on assessing the impact of a risk, you might also need to consider physical resources. There are certain risks if they occur. For example, if it's flooding and you are running a bridge construction project, you are most likely going to have some damages on the physical structure of the building. You are most likely going to have some damages on the physical structure of the bridge. If you are constructing a building or a house, you are most likely going to have the physical structure on that particular house or building. So you need to assess the impact. In case that happens, what are you going to do as a project manager? Or in case that is happening, are you able to avoid it? Remember, we went through the possible categories, we went through the possible responses that might come from you as a project manager. That is very, very important to consider. During the impact assessment, you also need to consider this impact on the staff. There are certain cases where if a specific risk occurs, it will affect the staff morale, definitely. Say, for example, there's a risk that a specific leader in the organization is going to leave, and this leader is the one who is representing most of the staff members in case they had any issues, and that person leaves the organization. That is going to lower the staff morale in the project, because there's going to be some level of uncertainty as to what exactly is going to happen in case there's no replacement, immediate replacement with the same caliber as compared to the person who left. Sometimes it can also be demotivating. Say, for example, I've seen it when you're constructing a building, as an example, you reach a certain level, there's a natural disaster like an earthquake, for example, or even there's a landslide, for example, and then the building is damaged. Now you have to start again from the beginning, because you cannot continue on a structure that you know it has got cracks, it has got some weaknesses here and there. So that kind of risk can also pose as a demotivating factor, especially to those who have started the project as compared to those who have just joined the project. So you need to assess the impact of such risks on the staff, the people who are working in the project, the team members who are working in the project. That assessment must be done so that if there's a way you can have plan B in case it happens, then at least you can take it from there. The other consideration when you are assessing the impact of a risk is other projects. I've been in projects where our product was supposed to fit into the next project. So if we were to delay to complete our project, which means our product was never going to be used for the next project. So as a project manager, the assessment, or if you're a project team, what you need to assess is the impact of your project to other projects, especially if you're running a project which is interlinked to other upstream projects. Therefore, you need to assess the impact of each and every risk, because if you don't assess it or you don't plan for it and then it happens, it's going to affect your project either negatively or positively. It will also affect any other projects lined up after your project. So your impact assessment should always consider other projects, mostly the external projects, or there could be projects within a program. So you need to be able to assess the impact. You need to be able to plan for the risk, so that in case it happens, it won't be as devastating as compared to when you're not prepared. That is very, very important for you to consider as a project manager. One of the most important impact assessment you should do to a risk is also on the business level benefit. There are certain risks, if they occur, it will be very, very difficult to justify any business need to continue with the project, any business benefit to continue with the project. So your assessment must be very, very clear, and it must go as deep as business level benefits that they are going to get from that specific project if a specific risk was to occur. So there are certain cases, if that risk was to occur, you can just accept. Remember, we discussed the responses that you can do or you can make to a specific risk. So you can accept and move on. In some cases, you can avoid. So during your risk workshop, make sure that each and every risk that you have identified, you also assess the impact on the business benefit. The next related item is also to make an impact assessment on the timing of the business benefit. Say, for example, you're creating a new product. That's your project. and you have a competitor who is also attempting to create the same product. By any reason, the competitor is ahead of you. They've already managed to create their product. It's already in the market. And you are still maybe 80% of completing your product. You're still running that as a project. So as a project manager, you might be forced either to change the scope in order to meet the market demands so that your competitor does not go as much as possible. You might want to reduce the expected benefits because your competitor is now ahead of you. So assessing the impact of business benefits, timing is very, very important as a project manager. You need to do this all the way from the beginning of the project up to the end of the project. That impact assessment is very, very important. The next important assessment that you must do as a project manager is the quality. Quality assessment or impact assessment is very, very important. There are certain risks. If they're okay, you might be in trouble in terms of quality. Say, for example, a specific organization was creating some parts that you want to use in your current deliverables. And by any chance, they are no longer going to do that. And you have no other option except to wait for them to provide that specific part. That is also going to affect the project. Or if you decide to change, it might also even affect the quality of the product that you're going to create. For example, you're expecting a steel product to be part of the input into your project. And then all of a sudden, you're starting to get plastic parts or products into your project. That is going to affect the quality of your project. For example, you are working on a project to produce a certain product, and most likely there are going to be some electrical faults, and the product is half bent, or there are going to be some floods, the product is mixed with water, and so on and so forth. So that is going to compromise quality. So in your impact assessment, you need to make sure that you are assessing if the risk occurs, how likely and to what extent is it going to affect the quality of the project, the quality of the project products, the quality of the project deliverables. That is very, very critical as a project manager to make that assessment well from the beginning of the project all the way up to the project closure. So there are two main measures in a project risk management process. The first one is probability, which is the likelihood of a certain risk to occur. And then the second one is the impact. If it happens, what is going to be the impact? Is it going to be very high, or medium, or low, or very low? So that classification is very, very important. In the next section of the video, I'm going to take you through the concept of this probability impact guide. In some cases, they want to call it a PI grid. So it's a probability impact grid. In short, a PI grid. So in project risk management process, there's a very specific definition of what is a risk. You don't need to mix up a risk and an outcome or effect of a risk. So let's dive in to really understand what we mean by this. Normally, a risk is defined with a cause, which means what is going to cause that risk, and also the effect, which is the actual outcome of the risk, and also the event, which is the actual risk. So the sequence is very simple. You start with the cause of the risk, the event, that is the risk that is actually going to happen, and then the effect. I've seen in my experience, there are some project managers who are not really good at defining a risk. If you ask them, what is the risk here? They will just tell you the project will be delayed. Normally, that's not a risk. That's an effect or an outcome of a risk. You should be able to describe the cause of the risk, what is going to happen, which is the event, and what is going to be the effect. For example, you're going to say, if I lose this key member, this specific deliverable is not going to be delivered on time. This specific deliverable is not going to be delivered under the right quality. So at the end of the day, the business or the customer you're working on is going to be unhappy. So that is the complete listing of a risk. What is the cause? You're going to lose a very important stuff. What is the event? Once that stuff is gone, the production of other project deliverables are going to go for low quality. Then what is the implication? The customer or the end user is going to be unhappy. So as a project manager, you should be very clear on how to define what is a risk. A risk is not just an end statement. I've seen so many project managers making that mistake. It must have a cause, event, and effect. So I'm going to take you through how do you represent these three items. So the triangle, for example, is what is used to represent a cause. A cause might be linked to one risk or multiple risks. that can be triggered by that cause. Even the effect, it might be one or more effects. So this is very, very important for you to master as a project manager. It's not always one-to-one, but sometimes it is one-to-one. You have one cause, you have one event, you have one effect. But what I've seen with my experience, in most cases, you have one cause, multiple events, and also multiple effects. So that is very important for you to know, especially during the risk workshop. You should be identifying the effects, you should be identifying the causes. So in the next section, I'm going to walk you through the risk cycle. That is the process of identifying, assessing a risk, planning for a risk, and also even implementing the risk, and then monitoring and review the risk. So let's move on to the next section, which I'm going to take you through the risk. So in this section of the video, I'm going to walk you through the risk management strategy. This is a very, very important document, and it's prepared during the initiation stage of the project, which means you have done the startup. If you want to appreciate what is a project startup, I've done a video on a project startup. You can also watch it from my channel. So after the project startup, you go on to project initiation. This is where you're expected to be capturing your risk management strategy document. So what does it contain? I'm going to walk you through section by section so that we appreciate what is contained in a risk management strategy document. So let's get started. So the first section is on the introduction. What do you have to capture under the introduction section of the risk strategy document? You want to capture the purpose of the risk management process, the objectives, and also if you can also capture the responsibilities. So that is part of the information that is expected under the section of introduction. So let's move on. In the next section, I'm going to walk you through one of the tools or one of the important tools in risk management process in a project. It's called a risk register. So what is a risk register? A risk register is a tool where you document or where you record all the risks that you have identified in a project. Remember, I was talking about a risk workshop. So any of the risks that you have picked from the risk workshop, you now need to document that. You document it in a risk register. So let's go through the risk register, column by column, section by section, so that you understand what needs to be captured in that specific section. Now, you are done with all that is required to put in place the risk management process. Remember, we spoke about risk register, we spoke about risk management strategy, we spoke about risk checklist. It is now time to communicate the risks. How do you communicate the risks? Most of the communication strategies or approaches, they are documented in a communication management strategy document. I would recommend that you put all the communication into that document. However, at a high level, you now need to make sure that the risk register is accessible by all members of the project, although they might not be able to edit or change, but at least to be able to read, so that each and every time they are being reminded on who is responsible for the risk, who is the actionee, which means the person who is going to make sure that if that risk happens, what am I going to do? The risk owner is the one who's going to monitor and communicate in case that risk materializes. So communication is very important. You need to agree on the frequency of communication for the risk. That is very, very important. The content also of the risk, and also how much detail you're supposed to put in that specific risk communication. So in this section, we are going to look at the risk budget. You might be asking yourself as a team member or project manager, what is this risk budget? I've seen in most organizations, they try to avoid to have a separate risk budget. They actually want to have the budget as part of the overall budget of the project. So if you're a project manager and you're in that scenario, it means you have to roll up the budget to include the risk that you've identified. So in some other cases, there's actually a request for a separate budget for risks. That is very, very important. I would prefer a separate budget for risk, because if it happens, you don't need to go to the project board again to get some approval for the risk or additional budget. You just go into your risk budget, and then based on the implementation that you have agreed, you implement that specific budget based on the risk that is occurred. So my advice is always try to negotiate with the project board to approve a risk budget, so that if it happens, you won't need to go to them, which is normally time consuming, because project boards, except where the exceptional meetings, it's not very easy to get all the board members to come and also agree and approve the budget. But if you have it earlier, it's easier that you just fall back on the budget and then you start using it. So that is very, very important as a project manager. You must make sure you have a risk budget with you. So As a project team member or project manager, you might be wondering as to when are you supposed to start risk management process? Honestly, from my experience, you need to start it from day one. I understand when you are in the startup phase of the project, probably these risk registers, risk checklists, even the risk management strategy document is not yet in place. But as a project manager, you should have opened what is called a daily log. A daily log is opened from day one when you are appointed a project manager. If you want to appreciate and understand what is a day log, I've done a video on the day log. You can also check it on my channel and appreciate what is required in a daily log. So informally, if there's any risk that you have identified, you identify and also log it in your daily log. But formally, all the risk items should be logged and registered in the risk register going forward. Unless and until the register is not yet opened, then you have the right to log your risk in your daily log. But that is very, very important as a project manager to do. You have heard so many people saying triple constraints. If a project is well managed, it must deliver the triple constraints, referring to time, costs, and scope. I can tell you that is not always the case. What's the purpose of running a project which is going to produce a substandard product or result? What is the purpose of producing a product which is unusable? What is the purpose of producing a product which is not fit for purpose? Even if it was produced within the timelines, it was produced within the budget. So what is the purpose of that product? So quality is one of the constraints you have to consider in a project. A project cannot be considered to be successful when the quality process was not done properly. In this video, I'm going to take you through what you need to understand in terms of quality management in a project environment or in a program environment. So let's dive in. Hello and welcome to my channel. Have you ever heard so many people saying that the best way to manage a project is to deliver within timeline, within the costs or budget, and also within the scope? They normally use the term triple constraints to refer to time, scope, and also budget. I can tell you that is not always true. There is a fourth constraint that must be considered in any project environment or program environment. This is called quality. So you cannot say, I want to deliver a project within time, within cost, within scope, and it's poor quality. What is the purpose of producing a product which is poor quality? What is the purpose of producing a product which is substandard? What is the benefit of producing a product which is not fit for purpose? So this is where quality comes in a project setup or project environment. So welcome to the quality management process in a project. Let's get started. I hope you have enjoyed the video so far. If you are new to the channel, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe button, and the notification button so that you are the first person to be notified each time a new video is uploaded on this channel, and it will also help this channel to grow. So let's start by looking at quality management in general. Why do you need quality in a project? Why do you have to manage quality in a project? The main purpose of managing quality in a project is for you as a project manager. You as a project manager, you want to close a project that has produced something that is acceptable to the users. There is no value in producing something that is not fit for purpose to the users. It won't be accepted and your project will not be considered to be successful. So it is very, very important as a project manager to make sure that you are incorporating quality management in your project. So you might be asking, or you might be wondering, at what point are you supposed to incorporate quality? Quality management is normally defined during the initiation stage of the project. You have gone through the mandate process, you have gone through the project startup process, you are now in the project initiation stage. So this is the stage which you are going to define how you are going to manage quality from the beginning of the project all the way up to the end of the project. So how are you going to do it? There are certain aspects that have to be done first before you start considering quality. One of the first important points you have to do is what is called product description or product definition. So what do we mean by this? I'm going to expand it for you. So like in my experience, what I normally do as a project manager, I do what is called product-led planning. So what does it mean? I start by defining the products in a project. You might be wondering, what are products in a project? Products in a project are nothing other than the deliverables, the things that we are going to create from the beginning of the project up to the end of the project. It might be a document, it might be software, it might be a physical item like a building or even a floor or a tile. It could be a bridge. Whatever project you're working on, there must be some specific items or things or products or deliverables that you create throughout the project. So if you start by defining them towards the end result or the end product that you're aiming in that project, that is very, very important. It also helps you to incorporate the quality measures in that product. So the first thing that you have to do is to identify all the products. After identifying all the products, you also identify the sequence of how the products are going to be produced. Once you have identified the sequence, you go deeper into defining the products. So you're going to capture items like product description, the quality method, how are you going to measure the quality of the product, any boundaries, upper or lower boundaries of your quality. You're also going to define the acceptance criteria. This is very, very important. By the time the product is finished, someone must accept it as finished. But how do they accept it as finished? They have to go through the quality method. They have to go through the quality controls to make sure that the product satisfies what they need. That is very, very important. So the next part we're going to discuss is on the quality tolerance. So it depends on the type of project that you're running. It also depends on the type of result, service, or product that you intend to produce. There are certain projects where quality is actually a must or is first priority. I'll give you a good example. Do you think someone who is creating an air traffic control system and someone who is creating probably a plastic container or plastic packaging item, or someone who is running a project to create a writing pad, I don't think the level of quality involved is the same. So quality depends on the project and what you're working on. The air traffic control system that I'm talking about, there is no way you can play around with quality. There's no way you can play around with quality because it will affect the lives of human beings. So it is better for you, even if it's going to extend, it's going to be over budget, but it's better for you to have it go through or go past the deadline, and then at the end of the day, you produce the right quality. As compared to someone who is working on a project to produce a writing pad, they can compromise quality because writing pad is not going to affect someone's life, it's not going to affect environment. There are a lot of items that you have to take into consideration when it comes to quality. It all depends on the type of project that you're running. For me, I've been running even software projects before. Quality is very important. I can tell you, it is easier for users to forget something that is working properly, even if it was delayed or even if it was over budget, as compared to a project which is actually of poor quality, delivered on time, delivered within budget, but users are still complaining. They'll still complain even 3 or 4 years after that. But if it was good quality, they'll forget about all these budget overruns. They'll forget about all these timelines that were exceeded. So I would advise you that you should always incorporate quality in a project management process. That is very, very important. And it must be done from the beginning all the way up to the end of the project. So in this section, we're going to look at what normally affects the quality of products or deliverables in a project. So the first one comes from the customer satisfaction or customer acceptance criteria. If a certain product is very strict in terms of quality, definitely as a project manager, what you have to include or to incorporate in a quality management process, it has to be of higher value. Because if you don't do that, the client is going to reject the item. Once that item is rejected by the client, then it means the whole project has failed. So customer requirements or customer satisfaction, customer criteria, they are very important when it comes to quality in a project management scenario. You also have to make sure that you have understood the expectation from the customer. You have understood the acceptance criteria from the customer. If you have understood that, it becomes very easy as a project manager to incorporate it, especially in your project planning process. In a project planning process, you might consider the quality tests. You might even consider the quality, I normally call them checkpoints in my projects, where, for example, after delivering a project to a certain extent, you want things to be checked. You want quality control items to be done. So it's very, very important that you are very clear in terms of customer expectations, acceptance criteria. Then, the next item you also have to consider when it comes to the quality management in a project is your project approach. I've done a video on project approaches. You can also check it on my channel for additional information. So what do we mean by project approach? I'll give you simple examples. For example, when it comes to software, you might not want to do the project, or you might not want to produce the product from scratch. So as an approach to your project, you might decide to go for open source softwares. Open source, what do we mean by this? The software is already running. but probably it's not satisfying your requirements. So you take the software, you adjust it based on your requirements, and then you deploy it into production. You can also decide to go for what is called an off-the-shelf system. So in a project, it might require a certain system. Say, for example, you want a system that is going to help you to manage the finances in a project. So you might go for an off-the-shelf product instead of creating one financial management product. So that is the project approach that we are talking about. On the project approach, we can even look at resources. Are you going to use internal resources or you're going to use external resources? That also determines the type, the level, and the kind of quality management process that you're going to follow in a project. Say, for example, you have decided to outsource the production of some of your deliverables, and the expectation is wherever you're going to assign, or whoever you're going to assign to help you on that particular product, they might try to consider their own internal standards, their own safety issues, and so on and so forth. So you're no longer going to be bound to do a lot of quality management in your project because you have outsourced that particular item. So it is very important for you to appreciate the project approach. Project approach is what is going to determine your quality management process in your project. That is very important. You must take note of that as a project. In this section of the video, I'm going to take you through the quality management strategy document. This is the document that is normally produced during the initiation stage, and it has to come before any project planning activities in the initiation stage. The reason being that you might want to plan for the quality management processes, quality methods, quality records, or deliverables that you have to consider in the project. So let's dive in. So when you're preparing a quality management document, or when you're preparing your quality management strategy, the first thing that you have to make sure you've captured is the introduction. You are supposed to introduce whoever is going to use the document. What is the purpose of the document? What are the objectives of the document? What is going to be the format of the document? So that is to form part of your introduction to the quality management strategy document. The second part is going to be the quality management procedure. This is very important. You need to define in your strategy, how is quality going to be incorporated in your project? How are you going to identify quality items? How are you going to measure? How are you going to close quality items? How are you going to make sure that the error sheets, they are also recorded? So it's very important that you define the quality management procedure in your quality management strategy document. So the next item is to consider the quality planning in your strategy. How are you going to plan the quality management process? I can tell you it can never be done once. Quality management is a process that you have to take through from the beginning of the project all the way up to the end of the project. So the first point or the first entry you're going to meet the requirements for quality control, quality management is beginning of stage and also end of stage. Some they want to call it a phase or end of phase. So normally quality planning is done at 3 different levels, like any project plan. You start at project level, and then you also go at team level. That is very, very important, okay? So quality planning is also done mainly in a project for 2 levels, based on my experience. The first level is at project level, then the second level is at team planning level. So you find most of the team plans, they come out when you are in a stage or in a phase of a project. So it is very, very important that you make sure that you have this quality plan in place, especially before the start of a phase, because every phase is normally going to have some deliverables or some products that you have to create throughout the project. So how are you going to measure the quality of those products? How are you going to ensure that the products, they are meeting the required standards? Even if they have finished, you still need to make sure that there's quality check, there's quality control on these products. So quality planning must be part of your strategy. So what are you planning? You're planning on how and when are you going to do the quality management? When are you going to do the quality process? When are you going to do the quality control in a project? That is very important. So the other section in your quality strategy document is to make sure that you have defined the quality controls. What do we mean by quality control? Quality control is different from quality assurance. You should take note of that. Quality assurance is normally the audit from external to the project or even external to the organization. But when you're talking of quality control, these are the members or stakeholders who are involved in the project throughout the production of any deliverables. So we are talking of 2 ways of doing quality control. The first one being what is called in-process quality control, which means the products are being checked as they are being produced. So you check them one by one. For example, say you are producing a certain metallic parts of a machine. Obviously, one of the in-process quality checks is to have some engineers coming with some calipers just to measure, say for example, the diameter of the part, or even the length of the part, the thickness of the part, even the weight. So these are what are called in-process quality controls, which means as you move from one stage to the other, someone is checking what you're doing. This is a very important process, especially if you're not able to redo the result, you're not able to redo the service, if you're not able to redo the production of the product. So it is better that you don't move very far for you to discover that there's a problem. You can move slowly, step by step, having some acceptance criteria being checked as part of your quality control activities, and then you move on. The next part of quality control, the next category of quality control is what is called appraisal process. So what do we mean by appraisal? Appraisal is normally what comes after the product is finished, which means if you were, for example, creating some specific plastic container, as an example, someone will measure the thickness, someone is going to measure the weight, the length also of that particular product. But it is towards the end. So it's also normally done in two sections. The first one is what is called objective, which means you are doing an objective measurement based on the project. It means you are doing an objective measurement based on the product. And also, this can be measured. It's based on facts. For example, someone is going to ask you, is it 5 centimeters? Is it 2 kgs? Is it 8 kgs? So that is measurable, and you can record that as part of your quality management process. Then the second part of the appraisal process is subjective in most ways. Say, for example, the project was supposed to produce a certain healthy drink, for example. If someone is going to be asked, can you test, is it tasty? Is it sweet? Is it sour? So those are some of the subjective quality control or quality measurement items that you can put in a project. However, the subjective ones, they are, like the name says, they are subjective. Someone might test it sour, someone might test it sweet. So at the end of the day, based on the acceptance criteria of the client, you might also invite the client to also do some tests to accept if that particular drink is good for them. So that is the second part of what is called appraisal process. So quality control in a project is very important, and it's normally in two parts: in process, quality control, and appraisal, quality control. So the next item you need to consider in your quality management strategy is the tools and techniques. So as a project manager, you have accepted, you have agreed that you need to incorporate quality control or quality measurement or management in your project. You also need to define what tools are you going to use. For example, if it's a physical product, obviously you need some ways to measure, for example, the length, the weight, and the height. So if you are to measure the weight, definitely you need something like a scale to measure that. If it was software, for example, you might want some testing tools, say for example, for security. You want to test for security. You want to test even for speed or what is called performance, as an example. So it's very important that you define early in the initial stage of the project. What quality tools and techniques are you going to use? Is it something that is going to be automated in terms of quality checks? Is it something that is going to be semi-automated? Or is it something that is going to be manual? So your techniques must be very clear. You shouldn't be guessing when it comes to management, when it comes to measuring of those quality items. It must be defined from the beginning of the project, especially on the tools. If you don't define the tools, you're going to realize that by the time you're about to do the quality management, you don't have the right tools to do that. That might end up delaying the project. So it is very important that you consider that. The next item is also on the records of the quality management process. It must be part of your strategy. What records are you going to have as part of your quality management process? For example, you might have what are called test scripts. Some they want to call them test logs, as an example. You might also have records like error sheets. In terms of error, how are you going to record them? You also have that. And also you're going to have, for example, your quality register. Are you going to make it electronic? Are you going to make it physical? Is it going to be local to your network? Is it going to be in the cloud? So it is also very important that you are very sure of how you are going to do the recordings of quality in your project. So the next item that is expected in your quality management strategy is reporting. There's no way you can just have quality management activities which are not reported, especially to the project board. They want to understand and they want to know how the quality management is being applied in the project. So you might find one or two board members who might be interested in knowing, in terms of quality, how are you actually doing it in your project? Can you demonstrate to us? Can you show us? Can you give us some assurance that quality management is being done and whatever the project is running on is going to produce what is required? So how do these board members, for example, get to know about this? You do it through reporting. What I normally do in my projects is each and every reporting frequency, say for example it's weekly or monthly, I always try to put either one document or one slide specifically focusing on quality. And I would advise you to do the same. Most people, they tend to forget about quality because they're focusing more on cost, timelines, and probably scope. But you find that with time, it's very important that you also have a way to report on quality. I can tell you from my experience, if you don't focus, if you don't stand your ground on quality management in a project, quality is the first casualty of any project pressures. It is the easy target for each and every project pressure. Say for example, your project is no longer going to be seen to be delivered within the same budget. You might end up being forced to compromise on quality and assuming that you sort it out later. And you find so many people agreeing to that idea. We want our products to have 5 acceptance criteria. Someone will start suggesting that even 3 is okay. You can take it and then we'll sort things later. So my advice is you should always stand your ground as a project manager when it comes to quality management. Always make sure that you incorporate, no matter how small the project is, no matter how big the project is. What only differs is the level of quality management that you do. If it's something that is a quick and dirty project, of course you are not expected to spend more time on quality, but you should at least do some quality management in that small project. That is very critical and that is very, very important. So, the next point is also on the timing of the quality management activities. It is very crucial as a project manager that you define early how, who, and at what point are you going to do the quality management. Remember, you want to incorporate quality management activities in your plan. How are you going to incorporate it if you don't know when it's going to be done? Say, for example, you want to incorporate quality management activities before the start of any stage, and probably it's going to take another week or 2. So that time impact on a project planning is very important to consider. So always make sure that the timing of quality activities, they are defined. In some cases, you might find some of these quality activities might require external people to the organization or even external entities to the organization. I can give you a good example. Suppose you are constructing a 5-story building. You might be forced to bring in local inspectors or local board inspectors who are going to look at the building, who are going to inspect whether you're using the right materials, whether in terms of safety even of the employees, is it there? In terms of the environment, is it okay? So imagine you have not considered the quality or the timing of these quality management activities. You want to book for that local board authority or inspectors to come, they tell you they are fully booked for the next 2 or 3 months. Last but not least on your quality management strategy is the roles and responsibilities. I need to expand on this. So you have already identified the acceptance criteria from the user or the beneficiaries of the project. You have also identified the quality methods that you're going to use in the project. You have even identified the boundaries, whether lower or upper boundary of the acceptance or the tolerance that you're going to have for the product. And you have also identified the frequency and also the timing of the quality management activities. The most important item now is to define the roles and responsibilities. In the quality management process as a whole, who is going to be responsible for what? For example, what I normally do in my project, when it comes to quality management strategy document, as a project manager, I'm responsible. If you want me to create more videos based on the ideas, the concepts, or any of the points that we have discussed earlier, or you want me to clarify, you need any clarifications, let me know in the comment section below.